Welcome to Fairy Tale Nights, where we invite you to relax, unwind, and get lost in magical story. Tonight, we're sharing a special Halloween fairy tale called The Lanterns of Hollow Hill. In this enchanting tale, a young woman named Evelyn discovers that the ancient tradition of lighting lanterns on Halloween is far more than just a village custom. It's the key to guiding lost spirits home. Before we continue with this magical fairy tale, I want to ask for your help. I'm trying to reach 1,000 subscribers by the end of the year. This helps me immensely to keep making these sleep stories. It would mean the world to me if you could subscribe. And now, sit back, close your eyes, and let this mystical story carry you away into the world of Hollow Hill. Once upon a crisp autumn night, when the harvest moon hung low in the sky and the leaves whispered secrets in the wind, there was a village called Hollow Hill, nestled between the shadowy peaks of a forgotten valley. It was a place where stories of old lingered like mist, stories of witches, spirits, and lanterns that flickered with a life of their own. On this particular Halloween, the village stood on the cusp of its ancient tradition, one that both terrified and enchanted its people, the Festival of the Lanterns. For centuries, the villagers of Hollow Hill would carve pumpkins and place them along the winding paths of the hills, their hollow eyes glowing with candlelight. It was said that the lanterns would guide spirits of the dead back to the underworld, ensuring they would not linger in the land of the living. The ritual was a solemn one, despite the festive air, and no one dared neglect it for fear of what might happen if the spirits were left to wander. But not everyone in Hollow Hill believed in the old stories. Among them was a young woman named Evelyn. Unlike her fellow villagers, Evelyn saw the tales of spirits and witches as charming folklore, nothing more. She lived alone in a small cottage at the edge of the village, where the forest pressed close and the hills beyond beckoned with their eerie allure. Evelyn was an artist, known for her remarkable skill at carving intricate designs into pumpkins that dazzled and amazed all who saw them. Her lanterns were the highlight of the festival each year. With deft hands, she would carve elegant patterns of vines, animals, and geometric shapes, transforming simple pumpkins into glowing works of art. People would stop to admire her work, but for Evelyn, the tradition was simply a form of artistic expression. She found it difficult to believe that her beautifully crafted lanterns could actually serve a supernatural purpose. Yet, as the festival drew nearer that year, a strange sense of unease began to settle over the village. The air felt colder, sharper, and whispers of unusual happenings floated through the town. Some claimed to have seen figures in the woods, shadowy, half-formed shapes that vanished when approached. Others spoke of hearing faint voices on the wind, voices that sounded almost human, but not quite. The villagers muttered about an omen, that this year's Festival of the Lanterns would be different, though no one could explain why. Hollow Hill was not a large village, but its isolation in the valley made it feel insular, almost cut off from the rest of the world. The villagers, though friendly, had grown cautious as Halloween approached. The Festival of the Lanterns was meant to keep them safe, but it seemed that something had shifted this year. The usual light-hearted air around the festival was replaced with something more ominous. Elderly townsfolk, whose memories stretched further than most, shared their stories in whispers. They spoke of times long ago when the spirits had not been properly guided, when mischief and disaster followed. In those days, the lanterns had not been as elaborate as they were now, just simple, hollowed-out pumpkins. But even back then, the villagers had known their importance. "The spirits must be shown the way," said old Marjorie, the village's unofficial historian, whose gnarled hands shook as she spoke. "If we fail them, they will stay." Evelyn had heard the stories countless times growing up, but now they felt more like warnings than idle gossip. Even so, she couldn't bring herself to believe in the fantastical notion that carved pumpkins could lead lost souls to rest. One night, as Evelyn walked home from town, her path lit only by the distant glow of lanterns, she heard something that made her stop. It was faint, barely audible, like the soft hum of wind through trees. But it wasn't the wind. It was something more purposeful. It almost sounded like voices. She turned, scanning the dark woods that lined the path, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling lingered that she was not alone. Pulling her coat tighter around herself, she hurried the rest of the way home, the feeling of eyes on her back pressing her forward. That night, as she sat by the fire, carving yet another pumpkin, the unease from earlier stayed with her. The designs she had planned no longer came so easily. Her usual confidence faltered as her hands hesitated over the smooth surface of the pumpkin. She tried to shake it off as nothing more than nerves, but the longer she worked, the stronger the feeling became. Finally, unable to concentrate any longer, she set down her carving tools and stood. The air in her cottage was stifling, and she needed a breath of fresh air. But as soon as she opened the door, she froze. There, at the edge of her yard, stood a figure cloaked in shadow. It was the same figure she had seen days earlier when they had left her with the strange, unsettling box. The stranger had returned. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she did not retreat. She stepped forward cautiously, her breath forming small clouds in the chill air. "You again," she said, her voice barely steady. "What do you want?" The figure did not answer at first. They stood perfectly still, their face hidden beneath the wide-brimmed hat, their cloak billowing ever so slightly in the breeze. Finally, they spoke. "It is nearly time," the figure said, their voice a low, distant echo, as if carried on the wind from another place. "The veil between worlds thins. You must be ready." "I don't understand," Evelyn said, her frustration growing. "What is this all about? Why me?" The figure stepped closer, their presence sending a cold shiver down her spine. "You are the keeper of the lanterns," they said. "The spirits are drawn to you, to the light you create. They have chosen you to guide them." Evelyn shook her head. "I'm just an artist. I carve pumpkins. That's all." The figure's hidden gaze bore into her. "You are more than that. The spirits know who you are, even if you do not. On the night of the festival, you will see." You will understand." With that, the figure turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving Evelyn standing alone on her porch, the wind whispering through the trees. She closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. The figure's words haunted her. What did they mean? That she was the keeper of the lanterns? And why had the spirits chosen her? Her eyes fell on the box the figure had given her days earlier, still sitting unopened on the table. She had been avoiding it, unsure of what lay inside, but now curiosity and fear gnawed at her. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the room and lifted the lid. Inside the box was a single, small candle, unlike any Evelyn had ever seen. The wax was pale blue, and even though the candle was unlit, a faint flicker of light danced at its tip. It was as if the flame existed in another realm, just out of reach. Evelyn stared at it for a long moment, unsure of what to make of it. She had expected something more ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about this candle. Its presence filled the room with a strange, almost oppressive energy, as though it were alive in some way. Against her better judgment, she reached for the candle. The moment her fingers touched it, the temperature in the room plummeted. The warm glow of her hearth dimmed, and a cold draft swept through the cottage, extinguishing the flames. The only light left came from the eerie blue flicker of the candle. Suddenly, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, as if something unseen moved within them. Evelyn's heart raced as she turned, half expecting to see the cloaked figure again. But it wasn't the figure that had returned. It was the spirits. They were everywhere, drifting silently through her home, their translucent forms casting ghostly reflections on the walls. Their faces were pale, almost featureless, their eyes dark voids that seemed to stare into her soul. They moved slowly, as though caught between time and space, their presence both sorrowful and terrifying. Evelyn backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. Candle in her hand flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. She could feel the weight of the spirit's gaze on her, but they did not approach. Instead, they lingered at the edges of the room, watching her in eerie silence. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The spirits did not respond. They simply floated, weightless and ethereal, their forms barely visible in the dim light. But there was something in their presence that spoke to Evelyn, something that made her understand. They were lost. They didn't belong here, in the world of the living. They were trapped between worlds, unable to move on, searching for a way back to the peace they had been denied. And somehow, the lanterns were their only hope. Evelyn looked down at the candle in her hand. It was so small, so fragile, yet she could feel its power, its connection to the spirits. The figure had said that the lanterns were a beacon, a signal to the dead that the way was open. Without them, the spirits would remain lost, wandering the earth forever. The realization hit her with startling clarity. The stories weren't just tales. The lanterns weren't just decorations. They were the key to guiding the spirits home. The night of Halloween arrived with a bitter wind and an unusually dark sky. The moon, normally full and bright during the festival, was hidden behind thick clouds, casting an eerie gloom over the village. The lanterns, however, glowed brightly, their carved faces flickering with warm light as the villagers lined the paths leading through the hills. Evelyn stood at the edge of the square, watching as the final preparations were made. Her heart pounded in her chest as she clutched the blue candle in her hand, hidden beneath her cloak. She had spent the last several days in quiet contemplation, trying to come to terms with what she had learned. She still wasn't sure if she fully believed in the spirits, but after what she had seen in her cottage, she could no longer deny that something was happening, something far beyond her understanding. As the evening deepened, the village gathered for the festival's main event. Children in costumes ran through the streets, their laughter echoing off the stone walls of the buildings. Adults mingled, sharing stories and sipping spiced cider as they admired the lanterns. At the center of the square stood Evelyn's masterpiece, a massive pumpkin, nearly as tall as she was, carved with intricate designs that spiraled and weaved like vines. Its hollow eyes glowed with a soft orange light, casting patterns across the ground. But Evelyn knew that this year, the lanterns alone would not be enough. The spirits needed more than simple flames to guide them home. They needed the blue flame. As the festival reached its peak, the village elder, a man named William, stepped forward to begin the traditional speech. His voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of unease that Evelyn could hear. He, too, had sensed that something was different this year. Tonight, we celebrate the Festival of the Lanterns, as we have for generations, William began, his voice carrying across the square. The lanterns we light are not just for decoration. They are a symbol of our connection to the past, to those who have come before us. They are a way to honor the dead and to remember that we, too, will one day join them. Evelyn's grip tightened on the candle. The time was approaching, William continued, his tone growing more somber. But we must also remember that this night, Halloween, is a time when the veil between our world and the next is at its thinnest. It is a time when the spirits walk among us. And so, we light our lanterns to guide them, to show them the way home. As he spoke, the wind picked up, swirling through the square with sudden intensity. The flames in the lanterns flickered wildly, and the temperature dropped. The villagers huddled closer together, their breath visible in the cold air. Evelyn stepped forward, her heart racing. She knew what she had to do. Before anyone could stop her, she made her way to the center of the square where the largest lantern sat. She knelt before it, her hands trembling as she removed a blue candle from beneath her cloak. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she placed the candle inside the lantern. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the blue flame flickered to life. The blue flame burned brightly within the carved pumpkin, its cold light casting an eerie glow over the square. The warm orange glow of the other lanterns seemed to pale in comparison, as though the blue flame was absorbing their light. The villagers gasped, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. They had never seen anything like this before. Some whispered prayers, others clutched the hands of their loved ones. But no one moved. They were all transfixed by the strange, otherworldly light. Evelyn stood slowly, her eyes fixed on the blue flame. She could feel its power, its connection to the spirits. The air around her crackled with energy, and the cold wind seemed to swirl around the flame, feeding it. And then the spirits appeared. They emerged from the shadows at the edge of the square, drifting silently toward the lantern. Their forms were faint, barely visible in the dim light, but their presence was undeniable. Dozens of them, maybe more, all moving toward the blue flame like moths to a light. The villagers watched in stunned silence as the spirits passed through the square, their translucent forms shimmering in the cold air. They made no sound, but their faces were filled with a quiet, almost sorrowful peace. As they passed through the blue light of the lantern, their forms began to dissolve, fading into the night until they were gone. One by one, the spirits crossed over, their lost souls finally finding their way home. Evelyn stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had guided them. The weight of their presence lifted, and for the first time in days, she felt a sense of peace. As the last spirit faded into the night, the blue flame flickered one final time and went out. The wind died down, and the temperature slowly began to rise. The villagers, still reeling from what they had witnessed, remained silent for a long moment. Finally, William stepped forward, his eyes wide with awe. What just happened?" he asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn turned to face him, her own emotions a whirlwind of fear, relief, and something she couldn't quite name. I don't know," she admitted. "But I think we helped them. The spirits. They were lost, and the lanterns guided them." William nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the now extinguished blue candle. "It was the flame," he murmured. "It was the light they needed." The villagers began to murmur among themselves, trying to make sense of what had happened. Some were frightened, others were amazed, but all of them knew that the festival had changed forever. Evelyn, too, had changed. She had always seen the lanterns as art, as a tradition, but now she understood their true purpose. They were more than just decorations. They were a bridge between the living and the dead, a way to honor those who had passed and help them find peace. In the years that followed, the Festival of the Lanterns continued, but it was never the same. The villagers now understood the true purpose of their tradition, and they honored it with reverence. And every Halloween, Evelyn would carve her lanterns with a little more care, knowing that somewhere in the shadowy hills beyond the village, the spirits were watching. But they were no longer lost. They had found their way, and so had she. And that brings us to the end of the Lanterns of Hollow Hill. Just like Evelyn learned to guide the lost spirits home, sometimes we too can feel a little lost in our busy world. But stories like these remind us of the magic that exists all around us and the light we all carry within ourselves to guide us through life's mysteries. Thank you so much for listening and letting this tale be a part of your night. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love it if you could subscribe to Fairy Tale Nights. Your support means everything. I hope to see you again for the next magical adventure. For now, Enjoy the music to fall into an even deeper sleep. Sweet dreams and good night.